Well, welcome back to the Alberta Better podcast. Today, we're talking about the British Columbia election in our neighboring province just to the west. And we're joined by two of the best possible people to unpack this. Allie, one of the top political commentators in British Columbia, and Rob Shaw, one of the top political journalists in British Columbia. Allie and Rob, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us. Oh, I love that
Thanks for having us
intro.
on.
I want to take you everywhere I go, Scott, so that you could just introduce me to people as such.
Well, I'll happily do that. Today, folks, we're going to get you to maybe switch gears a little bit from some of the discussion you may be having over the next month. We know we've got a British Columbia election coming up on October 19th, but the switch gears is we're going to ask you to think about Alberta today and talk a bit about the politics, the policy, and kind of the implications on this really critical Canadian relationship to the now almost 5 million people who are your neighbors directly to the east. So why don't we jump right into it? Rob, you've described this election as something that will be a close, hard-fought, brutal affair. Why do you think that is?
Well, if you believe polls, they're suggesting to us that this is almost a near statistical tie between the BC NDP and the BC Conservatives, because our center right parties in British Columbia, used to be the BC Liberal Party, became the BC United Party, is now coalesced into the BC Conservative Party. So we're back to this kind of tie position. And the two parties are fighting it out in our traditional rural urban split of our electoral map over here, where the Conservatives seem to dominate in most parts of the province outside of Metro Vancouver and Vancouver Island. The urban centers and the NDP are big there. And we end up in an election where potentially, you got like a dozen ridings where this just becomes a close quarters fight to swing who gets our majority in our legislature. So that's why it looks like that scenario here. But we also have a rise of a new phenomenon in the independents. There's 6 incumbent MLAs running as independents in this election, partly because the BC United Party collapsed here and they don't have a home. And there is some discussion here about where centrist voters, federal liberals go and who they align behind. Maybe the BC Greens have an opportunity to kind of take some of those votes. So it's very fluid. Fluid is the word we're using out here almost every day. Fluid, 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 because it's changing so much in it and is looking to shape up to be a really interesting race.
Well, it is fluid, and it's so fluid that a few Albertans would probably be forgiven if they hadn't paid a lot of attention to BC politics over the last year, that a lot has changed recently. Allie, can you help us understand this? If I had looked at BC politics a year ago, I think I would have seen the New Democrats in what appeared to be a strong lead. Now the official opposition appears to not be officially running in this election anymore. A lot's changed, this sort of implosion reformation of British Columbia's right. Explain to Albertans what's happening here.
Well, I don't think Alberta is immune to the changing of political parties, as you guys saw with Wild
True.
Rose as well. And so there's a little bit of similarity in that. To what Rob was mentioning there, because the BC United suspended their campaign, and that's an important part to pull out
Mm,
here, is that it's a suspension of the campaign. The BC United did not dissolve as an organization. And so with some
right.
of these independent candidates that were incumbents from the BC United, there is always a potential that they could resume back to a BC United caucus if they were reelected. And so we had this changing of voter intention from the center right in the Conservatives and BC United. Because of the BC United suspending their campaign, they have kind of left this center vote kind of orphaned in politics this time around. And the Conservatives, given that they're such a new political party, they're still trying to figure out their brand as this right-leaning party that we didn't necessarily have in the last election. And so this trend of, can we rely on the last provincial election to figure out and do a crystal ball projection of what's going to happen this year, that's out the window, because we didn't necessarily have these dynamics before. Not to mention that, like, we still do have the Greens that are potential players in certain ridings as well. It's kind of chaotic at the moment, specifically on the center right of the political spectrum, which could mean for a very interesting, depending on how the election pans out, a very interesting dynamic as we roll out in a provincial politics afterwards, leading into a federal election too.
Mhm. So help us understand what sorts of policy or other differences really separate Kevin Falcon and BC United from John Rustad and the BC Conservatives.
I think the one of the reasons why we don't have the BC United as a voting option is because There was kind of a wide spectrum of policy announcements from the BC United and from Kevin Falcon prior to his suspension of the campaign. This was this like identity crisis that we've been talking a lot about in BC, where he was making announcements that would have potentially favored a little bit more to the NDP side of the spectrum. And then the next day, announced something that was, super conservative. And that's difficult to do when you're in a coalition government of federal liberals and federal conservatives, as the formerly BC Liberal, BC United was, and always had a challenge of balancing that coalition. And this time around, Kevin Falcon didn't necessarily balance that in a way that worked because of this rise in the conservatives, also offering a conservative option that was more in one lane versus BC United that tried to be everything to everyone. It was death by 1,000 cuts, but one of those cuts were that they were just all over the place. And then there was an overlap in what they would announce. Let's take the carbon tax, for example. The Conservatives said, we're going to axe the carbon tax right away, very definitively. And then the BC United said, oh, well, we're going to axe the carbon tax too, but with a little bit more fine print. Well, now the NDP are also saying that they're going to axe the carbon tax, but with some contingencies. And so there was this kind of analysis of like, where are we on and how we differentiate the political parties. And that's why, sadly, we don't see a Kevin Falcon on the ballot this time around.
Right. And you brought up a fascinating point there that I hope we'll get to again in a moment, that it sounds like in British Columbia, you've got the sort of right of center, center, and left of center, all to varying degrees, lined up against carbon tax at this stage. And I think that that's interesting for, frankly, all of Canada and future federal elections. But before we get to that policy point, I did want to ask just a little bit more about the mechanics of this election. And Rob, you've written extensively in your book, A Matter of Confidence, about the 2017 election and when it wasn't entirely clear after election night who the next government would be. Do you think we could end up in that kind of a situation again with this election?
It's possible. We have more ridings this time around. We're up to 93 ridings, so the majority is 47, seat. And as we saw in 2017, you need a few more than that. I think, the Conservatives seem to have certain parts of the province locked down. But again, the fight is for the suburban swing Metro Vancouver ridings in the kind of, Fraser Valley, which the NDP got into a little bit in our province, and kind of some of the more rural areas through Surrey, through Richmond, through our suburban areas. And it's possible. Like, a lot of people like to pretend they know exactly how all of those ridings are going to go. But when you get into some of our Surrey areas, for example, where there's more ridings in the entire northern half of the province in this one city, things start swinging very, very quickly. Because BC went through 2017 and we went through a minority government and we went through a small party like the Greens holding the balance of power, there's a lot of folks who still pitch this as the best way to do an election. And the Greens are doing that this time. The Independents are doing it. They're saying, don't give any one party ultimate power in our majority system. Hedge your bets. We're primed in some ways for minority governments federally as well. We see them operate. We see the idea of horse trading and coalitions and competence and supply agreements. It's not as scary as it used to be. And so there's a big element there of folks trying to pitch that idea. And the two main parties here saying, God, no, only we can defeat the others. The others are the enemy, and you must rally behind our righteous cause. And that messaging is going to be big in the election too.
And you've each touched on it, but the independents, just talk about that for a moment, because you mentioned some of the things that are now becoming more common in Canadian politics. But I'd argue, the potential role of independents in this election is somewhat unique. We don't tend to see a lot of independents sort of swaying or holding a significant piece of power. From either of you, do you think independents could make a material impact on who forms the next government?
Oh, 1000%. To explain how we got here, it was because of the suspension of the BC United campaign that some of these formerly BC United candidates decided, nope, you're not going to suspend my campaign. I'm just going to continue on as an independent. But equally, there was this draft that happened that the Conservatives were able to pick up some of the former BC United endorsed candidates, which pushed some of the Conservatives out. So it's not just BC United orphaned candidates, it's also some Conservative ones too. There are regional pockets where the independents can be very influential, mostly because they've band together informally the Okanagan, Kelowna area. They steadily have all independents in that region. And then I always like to bring up the independents who are incumbents in the Peace and
Mm,
Kootenay region, and that's Mike Bernier, Dan Davies, and Tom Shapika. Those three are particularly interesting to watch because they could stay as independents or they could go back to being BC
reform.
United. Yeah, and go back to a mini caucus as well.
Fascinating. Let's shift gears, as I said, to the BC Alberta relationship. So we have this incredibly important economic relationship, many shared industries like forestry, energy, other natural resources. I suppose we have a viewpoint of what an EB government looks like in that relationship. So let's try and cast our minds forward. What do you think a BC government led by Rustad as premier would look like, and how might it affect some of these industries that cross our border?
We have heard John Rustad's forestry policy and we've heard some of his energy policy, and they're much more aligned with Alberta than the NDP government has been in terms of like our forest sector, for example, has just been run into the ground, some might say, by a
Yeah,
kind of
mills
inability to.
closing, I've heard of. Yeah,
Yeah, there's
absolutely.
been 30 some odd mills closed and curtailed since the NDP took power because of a lack of access to fiber. All sorts of Indigenous consultation requirements had been brought in by the government on landscape planning. So, John Rustad's promise, which more aligns, I think, with Alberta, would be to reopen and ensure stability and supply of the forestry sector and get it back on its feet and, get it going again without the kind of governors that the NDP have put in on Indigenous agreements and old growth protection and several other things that have kind of slowed the industry down. On energy policy, the conservatives are much more in alignment with developing the natural gas sector and not ending our reliance on natural gas, which the NDP have kind of flirted with a little bit. You see some cities in BC flirt with banning natural gas and new developments, not supporting that industry, begrudging support from the NDP on our LNG industry that's just starting off, but a more kind of full throated support from the conservatives. So it would certainly be less of a tension point, our energy policy under a conservative government, I think. And we do hear John Rustad also talking about little mini nuclear energy support, which is banned in BC, but other premiers are talking about that. We hear him pushing around at the edges of what British Columbia under the NDP for 7 years have kind of made as their boundaries on resource development and on energy policy. And that would be much more in alignment, I think, with where Alberta is.
Definitely, when you think of Alberta, you think about a thriving energy and resource sector. Alberta's the destination for energy investment. And so, one of the things that I think would be very likely to happen if we saw a conservative government in BC is a joint effort to fight the emissions cap federally. And it's not limited to just the emissions cap, it could be a number of things that when we talk about the relationship between Ottawa and various provinces, it seems that there's, one province championing a certain issue, but there could be a potential on ensuring that the resource and natural resource
Mhm.
sector thrives, that BC can then be a partner in those advocacy and trips to Ottawa as well.
That can be really fascinating, actually, as an implication on Alberta. As I travel around Alberta, the oil and gas cap from the federal government would be probably the number one or number two issue of concern. We view it not necessarily as an emissions cap, but as a prosperity and production cap. And it'd be very interesting if other provinces began to take that sort of approach or viewpoint as well. Having said that, there's this sort of long and colored history of economic and political tensions between Alberta and British Columbia, despite the fact that we're such close neighbors. And a casual observer might be tempted to think, oh, a BC New Democrat government would probably get along well with an Alberta New Democrat government, or a BC Conservative government might get along well with the UCP government. But that's not always been the case, right? We've seen examples like Christy Clark splitting hairs with Alison Redford on natural gas and other development. We've seen Rachel Notley's trade war on BC electricity and wine at one point. Can you help us explain that dynamic from the British Columbian perspective?
I think it's always just a fight for resources, really. And because we get into different crises at different times, when we have a healthcare worker shortage, we're seeing those workers
Mm.
move to Alberta and then vice versa. So I think that's kind of where it comes on just that's a Western Canada dynamic.
Yeah, I think, and we were talking about this before the show, but I think on some social issues, a conservative government would certainly be more aligned with the Alberta government. The Conservatives in BC are looking to Alberta's model for involuntary care, for example. I know those discussions are already underway to sort of draft behind Alberta, which would put the provinces in more of an alignment on some of the social policies and some of the recovery versus,
Mhm.
there's kind of a sense from other provinces that BC has been very permissive in its drug policy and kind of far out there on decriminalization and on
Mhm.
vending machines outside hospitals that give out cocaine snorting kits and crack pipes and things. And the Conservatives are definitely trending away from that and more in alignment with some of the other provinces. And the NDP even now are starting to be like, whoa, okay, we might have gone a little too far there. But we've been an outlier in British Columbia on some social policies for a while now, far into the progressive realm and no one's followed us there. And so, a change in government might bring us more into alignment with some of the other provinces.
And now, as this campaign gets started, David Eby and the New Democrats have made some announcements about those policies that you've just described, particularly on mental health and addictions and involuntary care, as you were talking about it, which isn't a term that gets used a lot in that specific way in Alberta. But the idea of saying to folks, hey, you've got to go to rehab or treatment, and you got to go whether you like it or not. So that's one. And then carbon tax is another. Should you give us a picture of what the current New Democrat approach to those two issues looks like?
Well, they've shifted depending on how your viewpoint here. They've either pivoted or they've flip flopped, but they've shifted because the public sentiment is no longer fully behind their positions on that. The defense of the carbon tax kind of collapsed over affordability issues. Really, despite the NDP trying to hold onto it, everyone moved off and they were standing alone and they couldn't justify going through a campaign getting hammered on axe the tax when they're trying to come up with a better affordability agenda. And on voluntary care, they've just been whittled away by street disorder, business complaints, vandalism, crime, people scared. There's random stabbings, there's random events that are occurring from folks who are in full blown psychosis in their downtown cores, committing repeated crimes. The revolving door complaint of the justice system, which exists in other provinces but is very acute in British Columbia. Lots of horror stories of someone who's been arrested 70 times and sent back out in the system, and this continuing to throw a chair through a downtown Nanaimo coffee shop window every second day. They've become so acute that the New Democrats have had to move off of that as well. And so you see a begrudging moderation of those positions at the last minute, whereas the Conservatives have been advocating them for months. And we're getting into a point in our election where we might have less of a policy debate and more of a character debate.
Mm.
Who was more honest about where they wanted to go? Who is changing at the last minute because they look like they might lose? That is one of the undercurrents of some of the policy shifts in British Columbia that we're watching to see what the electorate makes of out here.
The difference between Alberta and BC on the mental health crisis and the treatment crisis is that Alberta has a surplus and has the luxury of a budget that can afford substantial investments in these areas, specifically for treatment. And then now to a world attention of the Alberta model, whereas there's a lens of skepticism when we talk about it in BC because we're billions of dollars in debt on our provincial budget. And so when we make these announcements that we're going to invest in X, we're a little bit more hesitant to figure out, well, where's that money going to come from? And we talk a lot about whether people care about a deficit in our budget. And it's one of those very obvious contrasts between these two neighboring provinces where one has money and one is very broke.
Yeah, and so you're talking about a little bit of sort of policy convergence. First, I'll say that it's interesting to see how the Alberta approach to mental health addictions and involuntary care is influencing some others. In Alberta, we're encouraged a little bit at the moment by some really positive looking numbers, particularly around numbers of people dying really declining. But I think we're still in the middle of that story ourselves a little bit here. I said earlier I wanted to come back to carbon tax. Zoom out for a moment. If we've now got effectively many of the major parties in BC, if not all the major ones, lined up against carbon tax, as well as governments of various stripes across Canada, as political and policy observers, Ellie and Rob, do you think is the consumer carbon tax done in Canada?
It's certainly seeming like it's heading that way. Mind you, I think that there's a lot of fine print when various politicians announce that they're axing the carbon tax, particularly in BC, where it's very much contingent on what happens on a federal level. And as we go into the next general election federally, David Eby could be in a position to say, well, I wanted to axe the carbon tax, but Ottawa wasn't playing ball. here. And so it's still very uncertain as to whether or not we will indeed be able to get rid of the carbon tax here in BC, depending on who's going to win. But very interesting that because of this blue wave federally under Pierre Poilievre, that this axing the carbon tax has really become a strong provincial issue across the board, given that even Saskatchewan is in the middle of their election as well and talking about the carbon tax too.
One thing that's important for other provinces to understand about BC's carbon tax position under the NDP is that although they might be getting rid of the consumer carbon tax, that's the new pivot from the NDP, they moved the big polluters away from the carbon tax a year ago in the budget to something that's called this industrial emissions target system, where if you're a major resource player, you're going to have sectoral caps on your emissions and you're going to get taxed according to those caps. And you can bring your emissions down by getting carbon credits from other industries in BC, specifically First Nations, who are going to get credits for preserving old growth trees and paper that they can then help us sell to other companies, like kind of a mini cap and trade system. So when the BC NDP say get rid of the carbon tax, they're actually still leaving it on industrial polluters. And the messaging they're advancing is we're still targeting the big polluters. And that's something to keep in mind, because in terms of economic competitiveness that you hear from BC businesses and different sectors, they're still upset about that. They're not as pleased at the end of the NDP's carbon tax as they are at and the Conservatives view that industrial pollution model here in BC as a massive hammering of jobs and resource development. And they're not speaking positively of it. I don't think they've said they'd get rid of it, but probably we're not a clean break from the carbon tax like other provinces might be.
To the Alberta business investment community, a lot of that fine print and a lot of that uncertainty really starts to think, well, is BC the place to invest in? And I think that's also a big problem that we have in our relationship between Alberta and BC is that investment confidence from major energy sector companies that are based in downtown Calgary.
Do you think that there is any future for projects of the past, like a Northern Gateway 2.0? Do you think there's any optimism around further LNG projects on the West Coast? This is something that gets a lot of talk in Alberta. Give us a sort of picture of that, if you would.
The road to even get the Trans Mountain Pipeline finished here in the Metro Vancouver area was a long road. It was an uncertain road, and it really depicted to the world, not even just to these downtown Alberta companies that I was referencing, it signaled to the world that it's going to be a pain and it's going to be a headache. And it really depends on who wins this next election if we're able to shift that. John Rustad's talked a lot about how he wants to attract more investment into LNG specifically. And then to what Rob was saying earlier, that the path for LNG in BC has been a begrudgingly one for the NDP and something that they were kind of stuck with, not something that they wanted to invest in.
If the NDP is reelected, they've been very clear their path to resource development is through electricity. You're not going to be able to build an LNG facility if you don't electrify it. You can't build anything without electricity. And they're dramatically increasing our electricity production. They've got a new call out for wind and solar power and things like that. I don't think the Conservatives have that same position, and the investment climate might be a little bit easier under that lack of, because it's more expensive to electrify the next train of LNG than it is to use natural gas to power it. So those are the kind of the main difference. The BC NDP has a climate plan. They're sticking to it, and it accommodates the current LNG and kind of pipeline situation of oil and gas, but not much more. And in order to fit within this climate plan, companies have to really show extra investment in reducing their emissions. And the Conservatives are going to lift that up. It'll be a different dynamic for investors who are thinking of building here.
Well, this has already been a whirlwind through the discussion of the BC election. Allie, I want to give the last question to you. You have a decorated history on a variety of campaigns in a variety of roles. Zoom us into what it's going to be like for the people working on these campaigns over the next 20 or so days on the campaign trail. Put us in their shoes, if you would.
This is a fascinating question because this week I've been getting phone calls from friends all over the country who are coming into BC to help on various campaigns. So what a time to be alive. On a conservative, center-right conservative side of things, it's going to be chaotic. This is a campaign that changes almost every single day. We have no idea what's going to come because of all of these changing elements, the independent candidates. This is David Eby's very first one as premier as well. And then these are two people who haven't necessarily gone up against each other, in John Rustad and David Eby. But it's like any other campaign, it's going to be chaotic. It's going to change day to day. What I have seen are a lot of new people come out to volunteer and to put up signs and to do the usual campaign activity, which is encouraging, particularly young people, because they're the ones who are most fed up with what's going on in the province. And I'm seeing this across the spectrum, not just on the conservative side. Across the spectrum, we're seeing a lot more young people, mostly because they're the ones who are really upset.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. Rob and Ellie, thank you so much. This has been fascinating. I can hear the energy in both of your voices. And I wish you a next few weeks full of lots of caffeine. And hopefully we can talk again after we know the outcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having us on.
Thanks for joining us today. And if you found this episode interesting or insightful, let us know by heading to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and giving us a quick review and a rating, or tell a friend about the show.